The scan happened at 0317 hours, ship time, and I remember exactly what I was doing when it hit. I was wedged into a maintenance crawl space on Deck 7 of the Triton flagship, eating something out of a tin that the label claimed was protein stew, but which tasted of rust and old sadness, listening to the proximity alert cycle through their pre-battle sequence on the other side of the bulkhead. Peed. Same sound they'd made a dozen times in the 3 years since the swarm pushed through the outer limits of the Oru corridor. Same cadence, same synthetic tone, the one the combat systems designers had apparently decided was alarming without being panic-inducing. As if the distinction mattered much when you were 3 ships against 400. I had eaten through proximity alerts before. I ate through this one. That is, perhaps, the most accurate description of my service record you will find anywhere. My name is Brass, Sergeant First Class Reginald Moss Brass, though everyone on the fleet had dropped the first part by then. Partly because the general's name was Moss, and having 2 Mosses in the same chain of command generated paperwork confusion, and partly because I had spent the better part of 2 years becoming the kind of man whose full name no longer fit his reputation. I was the supply sergeant, the logistics NCO, the man who knew where the spare actuator couplings lived, and which manifests the quartermasters had padded, and which requisitions needed a second stamp to avoid a delay that would hold up the line companies for 6 days. I was, in the unofficial taxonomy that develops on any warship running a sustained engagement, the heavy equipment carrier, the walking depot, and the unit's comic relief, a distinction I had not sought, could not seem to lose, and had come over time to wear the way you wear a uniform that no longer fits perfectly, but has been broken into the exact shape of your body. I want to be clear about what that means before I tell you the rest of it, because how you understand the rest of it depends on understanding what I was. When you have been on a warship long enough, the crews sort themselves into types, not by rank, not by specialty designation, but by something more fundamental than either, by the way they hold the weight of what is happening. There are the officers who carry command like a natural element of their biology. General Moss was that kind. Was a tall man with the kind of face that had been weathered into something, resembling a fixed topographic feature rather than an expression. And he had been running the Triton force for 9 years. And in 9 years, I never once saw him issue an order in a voice that contained anything other than the assumption that the order would be executed. Not arrogance, certainty. They are different things. Arrogance is what happens when a man confuses his own opinion of himself with reality. Certainty is what happens when reality has confirmed the opinion so many times that the opinion and the reality have become the same thing. Moss was certain. Captain Hired was that kind too, on a smaller scale, precise in the way that sharp instruments are precise, good at one thing, and fully committed to that thing in a way that left no room for doubt or deviation. The Cormorant was Hired's ship, and Hired was the Cormorant's purpose, and the two of them together were among the finest pieces of military hardware I had ever encountered. And then there is a third category. The men who are necessary in the way a structural bolt is necessary. You don't think about it. You don't celebrate it. You don't write commendations about it. But if the bolt isn't there, the whole assembly shears apart. That was me, Sergeant Brass, the bolt. The man in the crawl space, at a 317, eating rust-flavored stew, while the proximity alarms ran their sequence in the swarm fleet. 412 vessels, according to the latest tactical count, completed its approach through the Oru corridor's outer margin, and prepared to make the 14th major push against our position in as many months. I should tell you about the swarm because I've noticed in the years since that people who weren't in the corridor have a version of them in their heads that doesn't quite line up with reality. The version in people's heads tends to be dramatic, monstrous in the visual sense, enormous and terrible, something that announces its nature through its appearance. The actual swarm were not like that, or, at least the ones I encountered, were not. They were insectoid in structure, chitin armored, with a bilateral symmetry that was familiar enough to be unsettling, rather than alien in any straightforward way. Their senior caste individuals, the ones who operated in command roles, were large, perhaps 2.5 meters, with compound eyes and facial structures that included protrusions that reminded you of the pincers of certain Earth arthropods, but enlarged and repositioned in a way that suggested function rather than the decorative armament of the insects we knew. They moved with a smoothness that bothered people who saw them move. Not the smoothness of something graceful, but the smoothness of something optimized. The way a precision tool moves with no wasted motion. Because wasted motion was never part of the design. What made them genuinely alien was not the appearance. What made them genuinely alien was the cognition. The swarm operated in collective processing clusters. Their command architecture was not a hierarchy in the way we understood hierarchies. Not a chain of individual minds passing information upward and decisions downward. Their senior caste commanders linked neurally into shared processing nodes, what we called command nodes. And the node's decision-making capacity was literally greater than the sum of its individual members. Not a committee, not a consensus, but a merged intellect that processed information in parallel across multiple biological platforms and produced conclusions that no single member of the node could have reached independently. We had known this for several years. The analysts had written about it extensively. What the analyst had conveying, and what I understood in a bone-level way from 3 years of watching the swarm operate, was what this meant practically. It meant the swarm didn't make mistakes the way we made mistakes. They didn't misread a situation because a commander was tired or afraid, or overconfident, or emotionally compromised. They misread situations sometimes. Every intelligence makes errors. But their errors came from the limitations of their data, not from the limitations of their psychology. You couldn't confuse them with a feint if the feint required them to attribute fear or hesitation to you that wasn't actually present. You couldn't bait them with a perceived weakness if the perceived weakness didn't show up in the scan. Because everything the swarm knew about you, they knew from the scan. The scan. I keep coming back to it, and I will continue to come back to it because it is the center of everything that happened. The swarm's scan capability was the most sophisticated sensor architecture we had encountered, built over a century of expansion through territory that had never been able to resist them, refined against every class of vessel and every defensive configuration the galaxy had fielded, calibrated to the exact standard needed to build the kill prediction model that had been the swarm's operational basis since before any of us were born. The scan gave them, at the opening of any engagement, was this: hull composition and thickness, weapons load and type, mech complement and operational status, crew count and distribution, power signature and its implications for weapons and shields, shield harmonic frequency and recharge cycle, projected fire rate at current power levels, fuel and consumable status, and, most critically, a statistical model of combat performance based on every engagement in the swarm's archive in which ships matching that profile had participated. The swarm had been collecting engagement data for decades. Their model was not theoretical, it was empirical. Every ship in their database had a performance prediction built on real outcomes, and the Triton Force ships had been engaging swarm units for long enough that our performance predictions were among the most refined in their entire archive. When the swarm completed their scan at SU 349 hours, they knew everything about us that could be measured. That was the nature of the scan. That was what made it terrifying, and what made it, ultimately, the source of their single exploitable limitation. But I am getting ahead of myself. The data crystals were the reason we had held the corridor for 14 months, and I need to explain them properly before I explain what I did with them. Because the explanation has to make sense, or the rest of the story sounds like luck, and it wasn't luck. It was work. It was 3 years of reading everything I was responsible for, cover to cover, and knowing where every bolt was. And one morning, when all of that accumulated knowledge pointed in a direction that no one had thought to look. Crystals were artifacts from the pre-swarm civilization that had occupied the Oru system. Whatever species had built something worth preserving in that corridor before the swarm's expansion had erased them. Crystals stored information in an encoding we had never fully cracked. But what we had managed to extract was navigational and strategic data that predated the swarm's arrival in the Oru system by at least a millennium. system maps, orbital mechanics, resource distribution patterns, and, most operationally valuable, a complete record of the transit geometry of the Oru corridor itself, including approaches and exit vectors that the swarm's own archives did not contain, because those approaches and vectors predated the swarm's tenure in the region by long enough that the physical stellar drift had rendered them unrecognizable to a purely contemporary analysis. In practical terms, the crystals gave us 6 weeks of advance intelligence on swarm fleet movement patterns, because the swarm used the same transit corridors the pre-swarm civilization had charted, for the same gravitational efficiency reasons, and the pre-swarm charts gave us the geometry. Geos gave this maintenance hole intelligence the swarm wanted too. The gap in their own historical records that our analysts had identified as the reason the swarm kept coming back to this corridor despite the cost. They needed what was in those crystals, not because they couldn't function without it, but because incomplete archives were, to the swarm command architecture, a structural vulnerability they were constitutionally incapable of leaving unresolved. They processed on data. Gaps in the data were not acceptable. General Moss had divided the crystal set 14 months earlier, when the strategic value of the corridor had become clear, and the tactical calculus had made it obvious that we would be fighting here for a long time. Primary array, the largest and most legible set, the navigational charts and the strategic data, went into the Cormorant's vault, hardened against breach, under Captain Herod's authority. The secondary array went to the Vela, the support carrier, on the theory that the Vela was the least likely target in a primary engagement, because the swarm needed the fleet neutralized before they could safely dispatch boarding units to collect anything. Tertiary array was the problem. The tertiary array was 8 crystals. Small fragments, the analysts had described them. Probable redundancy, low strategic value, encoding unclear, possibly duplicates of data contained in the primary set. Nobody wanted them badly enough to fight over the storage protocol, and I had a hardened container in my depot that met the crystal preservation specifications, because I had specifically ordered and installed it 3 years earlier, against the possibility that we would someday receive materials requiring that level of protection. Because that is what a good supply sergeant does. He anticipates the requirement and has the solution ready before the requirement arrives. Tertiary array went into my container, under General's seal, and then the siege ground on, and the analyst moved on to other priorities, and the crystals sat in Depot 7, and nobody thought about them. Except that I thought about them sometimes, because they were in my depot, and they were my responsibility, and I read the maintenance specifications for everything in my custody. I had read those specifications twice. Once when the container was installed, once 3 months later when I was updating my inventory logs during a quiet week, and pulled the maintenance manual for completeness. The specifications were 47 pages of technical data on preservation environments, handling protocols, and, in a section toward the back that was flagged as relevant to scanner calibration procedures, a description of the crystal's passive SEM broadcast signature and the protocol for zeroing it. Crystal's broadcast. This was not a secret. It was in the public technical record. The swarm had spent decades calibrating their scan suite specifically to detect this passive frequency, because the crystals had been the swarm's primary strategic objective across the Oru corridor for the entire duration of their expansion. When the swarm ran their scan at 349 hours, one of the things the scan told them, with absolute precision, was where every crystal in the fleet was located. The Ardent, the Vela, the Cormorant. 3 sets of crystals in 3 specific locations, mapped to within a few meters. By the scan architecture, the swarm had spent a century perfecting. The maintenance specification included a provision for zeroing the passive broadcast in order to prevent scan interference during certain calibration procedures. Specifically, the realignment of the container's internal preservation field, which operated on a frequency to the broadcast frequency and could generate interference patterns that corrupted calibration data. You needed the container access code to execute the protocol. The code zeroed the broadcast. The crystals went dark on the scan spectrum, invisible, and stayed zeroed until you reactivated. The reactivation could be triggered remotely, from any point within approximately 100 meters of the container, using the same maintenance tablet you used for the zero procedure. I had read this specification. I had filed it in the part of my memory where I kept maintenance details on things in my custody. I had not done anything with it, because there was no reason to do anything with it. There was no reason to do anything with it until 3:49 hours. When the swarm completed their scan and my mind running the way a supply sergeant's mind runs, when he's been awake for 11 hours and is eating stew in a crawl space, processed what the scan meant in terms of the information the enemy had and the information the enemy did not have. The scan told the swarm where the crystals were. That was fact. The scan gave them a complete picture of our weapons, our shields, our mech status, our crew distribution. That was fact. The kill prediction they built on that data gave us 107 minutes. That was, for the purposes of the model, fact. What the scan could not tell them was what I was going to do at 0511. Because what I was going to do at 0511 was not in any weapons load or hull rating or mech specification. It was in 47 pages of maintenance documentation and 3 years of professional habit and a specific conversation I had had once with a signals analyst named Petra, who had been on the Ardent for 4 months during the Battle of the Helix Margin, and had offhandedly mentioned, over a meal that tasted approximately as good as the stew I was eating in the crawl space, that the swarm's processing architecture was optimized to confirm data to such a degree that conflicting scan inputs generated a measurable delay in their tactical decision-making. She had said this in the way people say things that are interesting, but not immediately actionable. And she had written a report about it 18 months later. And the report had been distributed and filed and not acted on. I had read the report. I read everything that crossed my desk, because that is the work. The battle started at 0413. Or rather, the battle that had been running for 14 months reached its terminal phase at 0413, when the swarm's vanguard committed to the final push rather than the probing actions that had characterized the previous engagement cycles. The difference was weight. Previous pushes had been designed to test our defensive configuration, probe our response times, identify weaknesses for the main effort. This was the main effort. 412 vessels, moving in the coordinated formation pattern that the swarm's command architecture produced when the decision node had committed to an outcome. Not an advance but a conclusion. They had decided we were finished. The scan had told them we were finished. The kill prediction had told them when. They were executing the prediction. The Cormorant absorbed the opening volley. Herod had staged his ship precisely for this. He had been watching the approach pattern for 40 minutes, and had the Cormorant positioned to draw fire away from the Ardent's damaged port batteries, which were the exploit the swarm had flagged in their model. 4 volleys hit the Cormorant's forward shields in the first 3 minutes. Herod gave back 6 rail slugs, and took out 2 of the leading swarm vessels, which was extraordinary gunnery under those conditions, and which I noted with the professional admiration of someone who did not personally operate weapons systems, but knew the maintenance specs on every weapons system in the fleet, and therefore had a reasonably precise understanding of how difficult what Herod had just done actually was. My crew was in the secondary weapons bay. I was watching the engagement unfold through the tactical feed that piped into my maintenance tablet, which was where it piped because I had requisitioned the feed specifically for the depot management system 6 months earlier, and nobody had turned it off. Gunner was beside me, cracking his knuckles in sequence. Kobashi had gone forward to deal with a coolant bypass issue in the forward access corridor that had been flagged 3 days earlier and that we had not managed to address in the pre-battle maintenance window because we had run out of pre-battle maintenance window. I could hear the calm chatter filtering through the bay speakers. Tactical calling out the swarm formation. Weapon stations reporting load status, the flat mechanical voice of the scan system. Updating threat assessments at 30-second intervals. 0439, the scan system reported. Ardent port battery recharge lag increased to 9 seconds. The original fault, the ATSIC the swarm had flagged in their kill prediction, had gotten worse. Of course it had. Systems under sustained fire degrade. The swarm's model had assumed a constant 8-second lag. The actual number was now 9, trending toward 10. At 0441, port battery 3 went silent. The swarm had begun exploiting the interval. I felt the first hull hit at 0452 as a vibration through the deck plating, the kind that travels through metal and reads differently than impact sound. Lower, more physical. The sensation of something fundamental being struck rather than something peripheral. Gunner stopped cracking his knuckles. He looked at the deck plating. He started again. Ishi found us at 0451 in the central corridor. Moving with the deliberate pace he maintained regardless of circumstances, blood dried on his left shoulder from whatever had gone wrong in the forward access area. He fell in without explanation. I did not ask for one. We moved aft toward the secondary mech staging area, which was deeper in the ship's protected zone, and which I had personally reinforced twice, because the original hull specs in that section were from a shipbuilding generation that had not anticipated the kind of sustained engagement we had been conducting for over a year. At 0453, Captain Herod reported the Vela had taken a direct hit amidships and lost her second engine, stationary, 300 kilometers off our starboard beam, not moving. I processed this fact and its implications in the way a supply sergeant processes inventory shortfalls. Here is the list of things that were supposed to be available. And here is the list of things that are now unavailable, and here are the operational consequences of that delta. The Vela was not moving. The Vela carried the secondary crystal array and the mech resupply for all 3 ships, and approximately 2/3 of our medical extraction capacity. None of that was available in any mobile sense anymore. At 0458, a voice I didn't know on the tactical channel said without inflection, "Swarm has begun breach approach on the Cormorant's aft quarter. 3 vessels. Estimated breach in approximately 8 minutes. Board. They were coming aboard." I calmed General Moss at 0502. I said his name and my name and the nature of my request. Access Authorization Depot 7. Tertiary crystal storage. And I said I had an idea about the scan, and there was no time to explain it, and he would have to trust me or tell me to stand down. I said all of this while walking toward Depot 7, which tells you what I had already decided. Tertiary's response was 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, the Ardent's port hull absorbed 2 more impacts. In 4 seconds, the swarm breach vessels closed its another 60 meters on the Cormorant's aft quarter. 4 seconds. General Moss weighed whatever it was he weighed. Whether I was the kind of man whose instincts warranted a code I was not authorized to receive. Whether the cost of being wrong about me was acceptable given the cost of being wrong about everything else. And gave me the code. I have thought about those 4 seconds more than any other 4 seconds I can identify in my life. I was a supply sergeant, he was a general. The gap between those positions, in terms of authority and consequence, is not small. He gave me the code because he had known me for 3 years and had watched me work and had apparently concluded that a man who reads maintenance manuals for storage containers out of professional habit is the kind of man whose instincts about storage containers are worth 4 seconds of trust. I have tried to earn that conclusion in the years since. The zero broadcast protocol was straightforward. 40 seconds of tablet work, 1 confirmation entry, and the tertiary array went dark on the scan spectrum. 8 crystals, each the size of a closed fist, warm in the way they always were. Warm in a way that felt improbable for what was essentially a mineral formation. But the analyst had explained it was a byproduct of the passive broadcast itself. Something to do with the excitation of the molecular structure that stored the data. And I had filed this information in the part of my mind where I kept interesting facts about things I maintained. I pulled the crystals and put them in a field satchel and gave the satchel to Kobishi. I gave Kobishi 2 instructions. Take the satchel to the forward airlock on deck 2, the exterior maintenance hatch, and seal himself inside it. Then, on my signal, broadcast the reactivation code. Kobishi understood immediately. That kind of man, not fast, not flashy, but complete. He saw the shape of the thing in the time it took me to say it, he said. The airlock is outside the ship's scan shadow. Crystals will read as being in open space. I said yes, he said. They'll think we ejected them, or that the original scan placed them incorrectly. I said either way they have conflicting data, and conflicting data costs time, and time is what we are buying. He took the satchel. He moved. I went to the secondary mech staging bay and got into my frame. My mech was a Class 4 heavy unit, logistics configuration, 12 years in service. Older than my time with the fleet. It had been intended for debris field navigation and cargo operations in contested environments, which meant it was armored against impact damage in ways that a frontline combat mech might not have prioritized, and it had a pair of suppression cannons that were designed for clearing debris and deterring out close approach hazards rather than engaging swarm warships. The rail mount on the right shoulder was not a logistics standard. I had installed it during the refits after Dunn's Reach, sourcing the components through a combination of legitimate requisitions and creative reinterpretation of the salvage recovery protocols, and I had maintained it since to a standard that exceeded fleet specification because I was the one maintaining it, and I did not maintain things to a standard below what I considered appropriate. The left arm's cargo handling claw had been modified during the Helix Margin siege to serve as a secondary strike limb. Not elegant, not ideal, but functional in close quarters, in a way that had mattered twice before. The frame knew every corridor and maintenance shaft on the Ardent, because I had navigated all of them, and the navigation data was locked into the piloting system at a granularity that went well beyond the standard chart. It was not a warship. It was a work truck that had been in enough fights to understand what fights required. I launched at ZO 509. Manual override on the bay door, no authorization required, because the bridge had enough to manage without processing a mech launch request from the logistics sergeant. The swarm breach vessels were visible on tactical the moment I cleared the hull. 3 of them, positioned at the Cormorant's aft quarter, with the geometry of something that has selected its entry point and committed to the approach. They were approximately 700 meters from the Cormorant's hull. The cutting elements were active. I could see the energy bloom on the tactical overlay, the frequency signature of the swarm's hull penetration tools running their pre-entry cycle, the kind of tools that could cut through our hardened hull in under 6 minutes. I knew what was in Herod's vault, primary array. The navigational data and the strategic intelligence that had held the corridor for 14 months. If the breach ships got through, the vault was accessible. The swarm knew exactly where it was. The scan had told them. They had a map. They were walking to the destination. I commed Kobishi at 0511 and said, "Reactivate." The reactivation signal went out from the airlock on Deck 2, from inside the exterior maintenance hatch, at a point that was technically outside the Ardent's hull envelope on the scan spectrum. 8 crystals, broadcasting their passive frequency from open space. Not on the Ardent, not on the Cormorant, not on the Vela, in open space between the ships, where nothing was supposed to be, where the original scan had shown nothing, and where the swarm's sensor architecture, calibrated to detect exactly this frequency with exactly this precision, now registered an active signal. I watched the third breach vessel pause. The cutting elements retracted. The approach vector stopped. And then, one by one, the other 2 breach vessels did the same. Not gradually, not hesitantly, with the precision of systems executing a new instruction, standby posture. The command node had received a data conflict and had entered reconciliation mode. I hit the third vessel with both suppression cannons at 400 meters. The hit registered. The vessel registered me as a threat, and swung toward me. I ran along the Cormorant's hull toward the stern, and the breach vessel followed me. And behind me, Herod's crew had approximately 90 seconds to 94 minutes, depending on how complex the scan conflict turned out to be, in which no one was cutting through their aft hull. The vessel that was chasing me was heavy, armored for hull penetration, optimized for close quarters operation in tight geometric environments, like the junction of 2 ship hulls. In open space, chasing a logistics mech running evasion protocols, it was operating outside its design parameters. This was not a tactical insight I had developed at the moment. It was in the engagement records I had processed over 3 years as supply sergeant. Specifically in the detailed after-action reports I had cataloged for our mech pilots following the 5 previous attempts by the swarm to conduct forced boarding operations. I had read those reports because the after-action records informed equipment requisitions, and I could not requisition appropriately without understanding what the pilots had encountered. The records were clear. Swarm breach vessels did not pursue effectively in open space. They were tools, not hunters. I was 340 meters off the Cormorant's stern when I heard the command channel. Its voice tight-clipped. Engines at full burn. He had seen the breach ship stand down. He was moving 2 rail rounds into the breach vessel, chasing me at 220 meters. The first hit the carapace and left a gouge. The second hit the junction between the carapace and the cutting element mount. The seam, the place where 2 different structural systems met, and the armor was necessarily thinner to accommodate the mechanical interface. And something inside the vessel decided this was sufficient provocation to generate a secondary explosion. Breach vessel came apart. Not dramatically. Swarm engineering did not produce dramatic failures. It produced contained failures. But it came apart. I held position in the debris field and breathed. The command channel was busy. Herod's ship was burning hard. The Vela had ignited its emergency thrust package. A one-time maneuver, single use. Not enough thrust to sustain velocity, but enough to break the static position and start moving, which was the minimum requirement. The Ardent's portside weapons team had switched to manual cycling on the battery sequence, staggering the fire so the recharge lag became irrelevant to the Swarm's exploitation model. This was something our weapons chief had been advocating for since the lag was first identified as an exploitable vulnerability and which the tactical staff had declined to implement because manual cycling introduced accuracy degradation. The accuracy degradation was acceptable when the alternative was allowing the swarm to exploit a 9-second gap in your defensive coverage. The processing delay ended somewhere between the 2-minute 40 and the 3-minute mark, longer than the analyst's estimate. I believe the variance was due to the nature of the conflict. The crystals appearing in open space rather than in a new ship location was a more confusing contradiction than the analysts had modeled, because it suggested either that our scan profile had been fundamentally incorrect, or that we had done something with the crystals that was outside any known operational parameter. The swarm's node had to work through both possibilities before it could reconcile, and reconciling the second possibility apparently took time, because doing something with strategic materials that was outside any known operational parameter was not something the swarm's model had a clean category for. When the delay ended and the swarm resumed offensive operations, the battle they resumed was not the battle their kill prediction had modeled. The Cormorant was 730 kilometers off its original position, running hot, weapons-free, its mech bay open and units launching. The Vela was moving slowly, but moving, no longer a static target 300 kilometers off our beam. The Ardent's port batteries were cycling manually. The recharge gap closed in the operational sense that mattered. The swarm could no longer time their attack runs to the second, could no longer predict the interval of vulnerability. And the crystals were back inside the Ardent's hull. Kobishi having sealed the satchel in the container in Depot 7 within 90 seconds of reactivating, well before any swarm vessel could have maneuvered to the rebroadcast point. 400 ships were still 400 ships. We were still 3. The math had not changed in any fundamental way, and I want to be honest about this because I think the story gets distorted when people tell it. And the distortion is in the direction of making the trick sound like it won the battle. It didn't win the battle. What it won was time. The processing delay gave us the window for the fleet to reposition. The repositioning meant that when the swarm resumed operations, they were facing tactile configuration that did not match the kill prediction, and recalculating against a new configuration takes time of its own kind, and in the aggregate time, the delay, the recalculation, the repositioning, we held. We held for 11 more hours. The swarm made 3 more serious pushes in that time. The second push put a breach team on the Ardent's secondary hull section on Deck 9, and we fought them in the corridors in the kind of close-quarters engagement that no combat doctrine adequately prepares you for, and that leaves marks you notice until the shooting stops, and you find them later. Gunner held the junction at Corridor 14 with a rail carbine. and 2 of our techs, until Kobishi and I could get there with the equipment we had retrieved from the nearest supply point. And when we arrived, the junction was intact, and Gunnar was sitting against the bulkhead, with his hands on his knees and his eyes very still, not cracking his knuckles, which told me something about the previous 20 minutes that I did not ask him to elaborate on. The third push took out the Ardent's port battery array entirely. I filed the replacement order in my head at the moment I heard it go silent. Old habit. You file the requisition, so it's already started when you get to the other side. Fourth push, the last one, 4 hours before the relief fleet threaded the far transit point, was the push the swarm put everything into, the one that the command node had apparently calculated would succeed based on the degraded state of all 3 ships and the attrition of the mech complement. They were not wrong about the state of the ships. They were not wrong about the attrition. What the calculation had not adequately weighted was the specific quality that distinguishes a force that has been fighting in the same corridor for 14 months from a force that is operating at its paper strength. There is something that develops in people over that duration, under those conditions, that does not appear on a scan. It does not appear on a scan because it is not a material property. It is a kind of stubbornness that has burned past the point where stubbornness requires decision and has become structural, like the way a piece of metal work hardens under repeated stress. The crystalline structure reorients around the stress point, and the material becomes harder at that specific location than it was in its original state. We were harder than the scan showed. We had been hit, specifically and repeatedly, in the same places for 14 months. The scan read the damage. It did not read what the damage had done to us in the direction of making us harder to stop. Relief arrived at 0618 the following morning. 2 carriers, a fire ship to replace the Cormorant's capacity, and a full mech complement that tripled our operational strength in the time it took to transfer the units. Swarm, which had been processing the tactical implications of the relief fleet's arrival since its first scan, confirmed the vessel composition, withdrew to the staging position behind the Sargasso Dark. Not a retreat in the sense, a strategic reposition. The swarm did not retreat symbolically. Processed options determined that the current engagement no longer supported the predicted outcome and repositioned to maintain force integrity for the next engagement cycle. This is what made them genuinely dangerous, and what made them, in the end, the kind of enemy that you could not beat by being stronger. You could only beat them by being different from what they expected. I came back aboard the Ardent at 0742 with a dented suit and a rail mount that needed full barrel replacement and a left knee that had been aggravated by something I had not registered at the time and was registering emphatically now. Ishi met me in the airlock corridor. He had cleaned the blood off his shoulder. He had a tin of protein stew, which he handed to me, without comment, and I ate it in the corridor with my back against the bulkhead, because my legs had decided they had done what was required, and were prepared to negotiate over what came next. Stew tasted of rust and old sadness. I ate all of it. Gunnar was in the secondary bay with the rest of the crew, and they were all standing, and I counted them, without appearing to count them, and got 12. 12 was the number I needed, and it was the number I had, and I held that number for a moment, with the particular quality of gratitude that does not have a useful expression. General Moss found me on deck 4 2 hours later. He walked the ship after engagements. He always walked the ship after engagements. I think it was a way of counting, the same way I counted, confirming through physical presence what the manifest could only report abstractly. He looked at me for the way he looked at things, appraising, level, unhurried. He said, the analyst wanted a full brief on the crystal rebroadcast technique. He said it as a statement, rather than a question, which was, also, the way he did things. I said, yes, sir. He said, is that in any doctrine, any manual I haven't read? I said, it's in the maintenance specifications for the storage container, sir. He said, you read the maintenance specifications for the storage container. I said, I maintain the container. I read everything I maintain. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man calculating. The silence of a man confirming something he had already concluded. Then he said in the voice he used for exactly what the words contained, "Good Sergeant," and he left. That was the commendation. "Good Sergeant. I have carried it for 11 years, and I have never been given any 3 words I valued more, because they came from a man who used words precisely and did not issue them without having weighed their accuracy, and in weighing them, he had concluded that good was the correct modifier and sergeant was the correct noun, and that the combination accurately described what had been accomplished and by whom. Hero, not genius, not savior of the corridor, good sergeant. The man who read the maintenance specs and knew where the crystals were and understood what the scan could not see. The official record of the Battle of the Oru Corridor describes the engagement as a successful defense achieved through tactical adaptability and coordinated mech deployment in the face of superior swarm numbers. This is accurate. It is also incomplete, in the way that all official records are incomplete, because of official records are summaries, and summaries are by nature reductive. What the record omits is the maintenance manual, and the protein stew, and the 4-second pause before the code was given, and Kobishi sealed in an airlock, holding a field satchel. Order. Held for another 8 months after that engagement, before the perimeter was established and the strategic situation changed sufficiently that the corridor was no longer the last position. In those 8 months, the swarm adjusted their scan architecture 3 times, specifically the frequency calibration that detected the crystal broadcast signature. Each adjustment was in response to the rebroadcast event. Each time they adjusted, I updated the maintenance notes for the container, because the adjustment changed the operational parameters of the zero broadcast protocol, and accurate maintenance notes were the work. Fixed. The analysts were interested in the adjustments. I gave them the technical data, and they wrote papers about it that I have never read in full, because the papers were not in the category of things I maintain. When the corridor was secured, the Vela was decommissioned. Cormorant went in for a full refit, new aft section, upgraded weapons load, and a prosthetic hand for Captain Herod that he wore with the same philosophical calm he wore everything. He came to the Ardent once, during the refit period, he speak with General Moss, and shook my hand with the prosthetic before he left, which was the kind of thing Herod did, without making a thing of it, and which I received in the same spirit. The Ardent stayed the line. I stayed on the Ardent. General Moss retired 14 months after the corridor was secured. He left quietly, as everything about him was quiet. A brief note to the staff, a physical walk of the ship. In the early morning hours before the day's operations began, the kind of farewell that only makes itself known in retrospect. I processed his personal effects manifest when the quarters were cleared. 43 items, including 2 dress uniforms that had never been worn, and a data chip with a designation I didn't recognize, listed in his own handwriting as personal, not for archive. I did not open it. It was not mine to open. But I have thought about it since, and I think I know what it contained, because I knew the general, and I knew the kind of record that a man like that would keep privately. The things that mattered to him, that didn't belong in the official documentation. The facts that were true and important and couldn't be adequately summarized. The names of the people who had been in the right place at the right time and had done the work that the record would not adequately describe. I am telling you this from the Ardent, which is currently on station at the edge of the second expansion zone, where the swarm has been moving with the same methodical patience they bring to every theater. We have been here 14 months, which is a number I notice. The engagements so far have been the probing type. They are mapping us, reading us, building the archive entry that will inform the kill prediction when they decide to make the main push. Their scan architecture is updated from the last corridor deployment. They have incorporated, according to our intelligence analysts, some form of countermeasure for the zero broadcast technique. I have read the countermeasure specifications. They sent us a technical brief on what their analysts had inferred from the swarm's adjustments. I read it the same day it arrived, because it is relevant to equipment I maintain. It is a good countermeasure. It addresses the specific mechanism I used. It does not address the maintenance manual for the replacement generation container we requisitioned last year, which operates on a slightly different principle, and which I have read, cover to cover, twice. When they scan us again, they will have the whole picture. Every number, every hull rating, every mech specification. The kill prediction will be precise. The model will be confident. The command node will look at the data and see everything that can be measured. I will be in Depot 7 probably, finishing a tin of something that tastes of rust and old sadness, reading something that nobody else has thought to read. The scan tells them everything they can see. It tells them nothing about what the bolt decides to do in the morning. The model says it's over. That's enough. There are things about the 14 months that I have not told you yet, because the story of the final battle is easier to tell cleanly without them. But they belong here because they are the context for why we were what we were by the time the swarm made their final push. You cannot understand the work hardening without understanding what we were worked against. The Oru corridor is approximately 4 light-years of navigable transit space between a collapsed stellar remnant, called the Sargasso Dark, and the last stable planetary system before the dead zone. Call it a hallway. A hallway with gravitational walls, regions of tidal stress that prevented large mass except through the specific geometry the pre-swarm charts described, and 2 usable transit points, 1 at each end. The swarm had the far end, we had the near end. In between was 4 light-years of contested space that neither side could hold, because holding the middle of the hallway required maintaining a position that was vulnerable from both directions simultaneously. So we sat at our end, and they sat at their end, and every few weeks they pushed and we pushed back. The swarm's pushes were designed to collect information as much as to take ground. Each push probed a different aspect of our defensive configuration. The first engagement, 3 months before my posting to the corridor, had tested our response time to a 6-ship strike on the Ardent's primary sensor array. The second had tested our mech deployment speed against a fast-moving formation of 15 light assault craft. Third had introduced the breach vessel element for the first time. 2 of them against the Vela, which we had repelled at significant cost to the Vela's hull plating, and 2 of the Vela's crew. By the 12th push, they had built a comprehensive picture of our capabilities, our response patterns, our equipment degradation rates, our crew fatigue cycles. The kill prediction at 0349 hours was not a model constructed from first principles. It was an empirical projection built on 12 engagements of data collection. They knew us. They had taken the time to know us. What they had also done, through those 12 engagements, was give us 12 engagements of data on them. We were doing the same thing, in our way. Every after-action report, every engagement log, every technical brief on recovered swarm equipment was going into the intelligence picture that our analysts maintained. The difference was that the swarm's intelligence was systematic and ours was scavenged. They had a designed process. We had people like me reading maintenance specs and after-action reports and signals analyst briefings, because reading was the work, and the work was all there was. The 7th push was the one that cost us the most people. I was not supposed to be in the engagement corridor when the swarm boarding party reached Deck 5. I had been moving a logistics cache to the aft section because the tactical team had requested emergency resupply to the secondary mech bay, and the most direct route from the supply depot to the secondary bay passed through a section of Deck 5 that became, in the space of about 4 minutes, the site of the engagement I was never supposed to be part of. 2 of my supply crew, Havers and Lim. Havers, who had been with me from my first posting to the Ardent, and Lim, who had joined us 3 months before the corridor assignment, were with me. We had a cargo sled loaded with actuator components and emergency power cells, and a case of rail carbines that were part of the requisition, and that were sealed in their shipping containers. They were inventory, and you kept inventory sealed until it was signed out to its recipients. We met the boarding party at a junction, 7 of them, in their carapace armor, moving with the smooth optimization that I have described, senior cast based on the size. Armed with the close quarters weapons the breach teams carried, contact discharge units that disrupted powered armor and mech interfaces at close range, designed for fighting in corridors and access spaces where energy weapons would risk hull penetration. I signed out 3 rail carbines from the inventory and handed them to Havers and Lim, and kept one for myself, and we held the junction for 11 minutes until Kobayashi arrived, with 6 of the line company's people, and the situation resolved in the direction of resolved rather than the other direction. Havers took a contact hit in the 3rd minute that burned out the actuator in his left shoulder and left him operating one-armed for the remainder of the engagement. He did not stop operating. Limb was not hit, which I noticed and was grateful for with the specific quality of gratitude. That is also a form of luck accounting. You run a tally in your head of the luck that has been distributed, and you do not spend it carelessly. After the 7th push, Kobayashi and I spent an afternoon in the secondary weapons bay going through the after-action reports from every engagement in the corridor to date, building our own operational picture of the swarm's breach team tactics. I wrote a summary and submitted it to the intelligence section. They thanked me and filed it. 6 weeks later, the intelligence section's own analysis reached most of the same conclusions through a different methodology, and that analysis was incorporated into the tactical doctrine brief that all station personnel received. The tactical doctrine brief included, in a footnote, a reference to the supply NCO summary that had preceded it. I do not know whether anyone read the footnote. I read the footnote because I read everything that crossed my desk. The 11th push was the one that took Dunn's Reach. Dunn's Reach was not a location we were supposed to be defending. It was a secondary transit node, technically outside the Triton force's assigned operational area, but it controlled the approach to a resupply lane that the Vela depended on, and when the swarm moved against it, we moved to defend it. The action cost us 4 mech pilots and a full wing of escort fighters in 42 minutes, which was the single highest cost engagement since the corridor assignment began. Process the logistics of the loss in the hours after. Replacement requisitions, inventory adjustments, personnel manifest updates, the particular arithmetic of absence, that is the supply sergeant's version of grief. You do not stop doing the work because the work has become more painful. You do the work because the work is the work, and the people who are gone did the work, and the only thing you can do to honor that is to keep doing it. After Dunn's Reach, we were down to 11 mech units from 37. The fleet's combat profile had changed significantly from the profile that existed when the corridor assignment began. The swarm's archive updated accordingly. Their kill prediction model, at SO 349, 14 months into the corridor assignment, was built on 12 engagements, and the current depleted state of the fleet, which was why it gave us 107 minutes. It was an accurate assessment of what we were, measured. What it was not, as I have said, was an accurate assessment of what we were, hardened. I want to return to the battle for a moment, because there is a part of it I glossed over earlier, and it belongs in the full account. The 4th push, the last one, the one the swarm had calculated would succeed, came 8 hours and 40 minutes into the extended engagement, when the relief fleet was still 3 hours from the transit point, and the 3 Triton force ships had been in sustained combat for longer than any continuous engagement in the corridor's history. We were running on emergency power in sections of the AR, where the main power grid had been compromised by a hull strike on Deck 11. The secondary mech staging bay was operating by emergency lighting, amber-tinted and insufficient, the kind of lighting that makes the familiar look wrong. My crew had been staged in the bay for 4 hours, maintaining what equipment we had, waiting for orders that kept getting superseded by the next development before they could be executed. The 4th push came in with 7 breach vessels, deployed simultaneously across all 3 ships. On the Ardent, 2, on the Cormorant, 2 on the Vela, distributed. The swarm had processed the first push's failure, the one I had disrupted, and had concluded that concentration was exploitable and distribution was the countermeasure. 7 simultaneous breach points, too many to defend comprehensively with our remaining mech complement. General Moss made the call that most people don't know he made. He pulled the mech units off the Vela. He made the decision to cede the Vela's hull to the breach teams and concentrate everything on holding the Ardent and the Cormorant. The Vela's crew was given the evacuation order. 41 people moved from a ship that was about to be boarded to the Ardent's secondary docking bay in 18 minutes, which was faster than any emergency transfer drill we had ever run, and which was accomplished because every person involved had run the drill enough times that the drill had become the thing itself. Not a procedure to be consulted, but a motion the body knew. The vela was boarded. The swarm took the vela. They took the secondary crystal array from the vault, which was what they had been seeking for 14 months, and which General Moss had sacrificed the ship to allow, because the alternative was sacrificing the Ardent, and the Cormorant, and the primary array, and every living person on all 3 ships. The math was clear. The general ran the math in the way he ran everything, without sentiment and without hesitation, and with full knowledge of what the choice cost. What the swarm did not take was the tertiary array, because the tertiary array was in Depot 7, and the swarm's scan showed the tertiary array as having been ejected into space during the earlier engagement. The container was dark. The crystals were dark. As far as the swarm's sensor architecture was concerned, the tertiary array no longer existed as a recoverable asset. I had not planned this, I want to be clear about that. The zero broadcast protocol had been executed to generate the processing delay. The fact that it also rendered the tertiary array invisible to the swarm for the duration of the battle, including the final push, including the boarding of the vela, was a consequence I had not modeled at the time. But it was a consequence. And the consequence was that the swarm took the secondary array and did not take the tertiary array. And the tertiary array contained, according to the post-battle analysis our intelligence section conducted, a set of transit geometry data that did not appear in either the primary or secondary arrays. Data that was not redundant, not duplicated, not of low strategic value. Data that the pre-swarm civilization had stored in its smallest fragments for reasons we still do not fully understand. Perhaps because the smallest crystals were considered most concealable. Perhaps because the transit geometry was the information most worth protecting. Perhaps because the civilization that created the crystals understood something about information architecture that we had not yet figured out. The analyst's report said it plainly. The tertiary array, recovered intact, provides navigational data for 7 additional transit routes through the Oru corridor geometry that are not represented in the primary or secondary arrays, including 2 routes currently used by swarm resupply convoys that the primary and secondary arrays did not contain. The strategic value of the tertiary array, properly analyzed, exceeds the combined strategic value of the primary and secondary sets. The low-value redundancy fragments, the bolt. I read the analyst's report the day it was distributed, and did not say anything about it to anyone, because the analysts had done their work correctly and accurately. And what they had found was what was there. And the finding did not require my commentary. I filed the report. I updated the security level on the tertiary array's manifest entry. I made sure the container was in proper preservation condition. That was the work. In the years since, I have occasionally been asked what I was thinking when I made the decision to execute the zero broadcast protocol and give the crystals to Kobishi. The honest answer is that I was not thinking in the way the question implies. Not the dramatic certainty of a plan fully formed. Not the confident calculation of a man who knows he has the solution. I was thinking the way I always think, which is about what I know and what is useful and what the gap is between what I know and what is needed. I knew the maintenance specs. I knew the scan architecture. I knew the processing delay report from 18 months earlier. I knew that the breach vessels were 8 minutes from the Cormorant's vault. I knew that the gap between what I knew and what was needed was narrower than it had any right to be, and that if I did not walk through that gap immediately, it would close. The whole calculation. That is everything there was. 3 years of reading everything I was responsible for. And one morning when all of it pointed at the same place. The bolt does not plan the assembly. The bolt is in the right place when the assembly requires it. You make yourself into the bolt through the accumulated work of being the kind of man who reads the maintenance specs and updates the inventory logs files. The requisitions before the requirement arrives. You do not become the bolt in the moment. You become the bolt over years of quiet work that appears, from the outside, to be unspectacular precisely because it is done correctly. I keep the depot clean. The inventory is accurate. The maintenance notes are current. The containers are in proper preservation condition. The work is the work, and the work is what makes the difference, and the difference is what holds the line. That's it. That's the whole story. Good, Sergeant.